Okay, now Mill lays out what he conceives to be a very simple principle. Can anyone in his or her own words put succinctly what is Mill saying here? What is the simple principle? Can anyone succinctly rephrase it for the class? Yes, Barbara?
Well, that you have liberty in as far as you don't harm someone else, but your liberties can't impede on or harm or diminish somebody else.
Okay, the very simple principle is, you recall in the last class we said the main problem that Mill is trying to confront is how far society can go in limiting your freedom, your liberty, before society has gone too far, and how far are you allowed to express your liberty before society has the right to interfere and says, you've gone too far. And Mill says the principle is very straightforward, it's very simple, and it appears he thinks it's pretty obvious. And the principle is, you're allowed to indulge your liberty up to the point that, up to what point, Barbara?
Well, it infringes on someone else or harms someone else.
Right. You're allowed to carry on as you please up to the point that it does harm to others. And society has the right to limit your freedom up to what point? Your name? Liam.
Yeah.
Up to what point? At one point does society go too far in trying to limit your freedom? What point is it?
Well, again, if you cause physical harm to others, but to me it sounds like you saying that you can hold your own. You can't be imprisoned for having your own beliefs.
Well, let's not go there right now. Let's just try to express the opinion. How far can society go in limiting your freedom? At what point does it have to stop? At what point does society have to stop?
Well,
Somebody else? Yella, at what point does society have to stop?
Have to stop you or have to stop?
It has to stop interfering.
When it merely concerns yourself and your own.
Yes. Society has the right to restrict your freedom, restrict your liberty, up to the point when it starts, society starts infringing on your liberty, that is to say, your actions or your speech, which aren't doing any harm to others. They only concern, in Mill's words, they only concern yourself. Society has only one right in terms of limiting your freedom. That's the right to, in Mill's terms, the right to self-protection. Once you start endangering either other individuals or endangering society in general, society has the right to intervene, interject itself, and put curbs, restraints, fetters on your liberty. Now, Mill pretends as if, and he's obviously a very smart guy, so he's not he's not naive in these matters. What seems to be a very simple principle is in fact not very simple, as should be obvious to everybody who's lived more than 2 years on the planet. Who can tell the class, what's the key word here? What's the problematic word? The word which cries out, begs, pleads for definition.
endangering.
Excuse me?
Endangering.
Yes, harm.
Harm.
How do you define harm? How do you know when you are committing an act or engaged in a exercise of your liberty which is causing harm to others? And that, frankly, is a problem that it's not just on obvious cases, as in taking a gun and putting it to somebody's temple. It's in areas which are just very problematic, so to speak, gray areas, which we're going to explore. But let's just take very obvious examples. So I might say to, what's Liam's friend's name?
Elise.
Excuse me?
Elise.
Elise. So I might say to Elise that your blouse, the color of it, offends my eyesight. you are causing me no end of distraction and discomfort with that color, and therefore you are inflicting harm, and therefore society has the right to restrict the color of your blouse to say just green or yellow. Now, that may sound very arbitrary, and you think, well, that doesn't sound like a very compelling argument about harm. But of course, we're making judgments about that, of that sort all the time, because we have what are called dress codes. And the dress codes are, in fact, a judgment by society about what certain forms of dress start causing harm. And so a sleeveless blouse might, by some societies' standards, constitute harm, namely it causes distraction. And therefore, you have a right to curb somebody's wardrobe on the grounds that it's starting to do harm to others. And that's not just some societies. We have to be sort of honest about these things. It's every society, because every society known to humankind has some kind of dress code. Now, you may say one dress code is more conservative or more liberal than others. That, to me, is frankly an arbitrary judgment. But leaving that aside, every society has a dress code, and therefore every society is making some sort of judgment about harm. As we discussed last week, there seemed to be a consensus that if Ethan came to class naked, just on strictly aesthetic grounds, the harm would be probably, in Donald Trump's words, tremendous. Do you know who Ethan is?
No, I know Donald Trump.
Oh. Well, that's tremendous too. Now, turning to the passage again, if we turn down to the phrase, his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Let me just repeat the line that comes before it, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized society against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Who can put in simple English, what's he saying there? His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Yes, your name?
Merlane.
Merlane, yes?
It seems to be saying that it's no longer valid. You no longer have possession or rights to your own moral, what you deem to be your own moral.
Actually, the reverse. The other way. I mean, you have the right idea, but it's the reverse. Anyone want to try? What's he saying there? His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Anyone want to? Yes.
To advance yourself or your own self-interests are not a good enough reason for you to be able to harm someone else.
No.
No.
No. I will try to give an illustration, and then via the illustration, I think the point will be made. So, let's take an example. We'll take Cecilia. Cecilia? Hi. So, Cecilia is a God-fearing, good Christian woman. She gets up one morning. She's heading out to church. She has her Bible in one hand, and she's passing on the way to church Sunday morning. She passes Ethan's residence. Ethan, if you think I'm picking on you, it's only because I know you have a good sense of humor. Okay? And she passes Ethan's residence. She has a very warm spot in her heart for Ethan. And she figures she's on her way to church. Why not invite Ethan to join her on this solemn Sunday morning? And she approaches his house. The curtains are drawn. the shades are down, the Venetian blinds are shut, we got curtains, shades, and Venetian blinds. He has 3 layers, so to speak, of protection. And then she suddenly hears these strange noises emanating from what is apparently Ethan's living room. And she then takes a peek. She manages, I don't know how, but Cecilia is a very resourceful woman. She takes a peek into the living room and she sees this appalling sight. A sight that fills her with such horror, dread, and disgust. It's the sight of Ethan sodomizing a goat. Yes. Yes. It's that appalling. It is that appalling. And at this point, she sees no alternative, given her sense of rectitude, that means righteousness. She smashes the window, goes into the living room, and she says, "Ethan, what are you doing? I am so shocked. I am so appalled. I am disgusted and disgraced, humiliated, and mortified by what you're carrying on." And she then takes out her Bible to show that sodomy is a wrongful act, let's call it that. And then, as it happens, she has her Bible in one hand, but she also has a crowbar in the other hand, and she proceeds to try to separate Ethan from the goat. Hey, you didn't understand the passage, so I'm trying to clarify with a vivid example. And at that point, Ethan, who is not himself unprepared for the occasion, he takes out his copy of Mill, he turns to page 18 of the Gutenberg version, and he says, "Cecilia, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." Cecilia, whatever you might think about the propriety, the morality, and even the physicality of the act, well, finish it for me. What's Mill saying there? Somebody, Ethan?
It's saying that whatever you might think of it, it doesn't matter, right? It still doesn't give you any right to interfere.
Who's to say it's not good for us?
You do not have the right on the ground that you think it's his it's in his interest, his own good, whether it be his physical good or his moral good. You have no right to intervene. Sufficient warrant means it's not sufficient grounds for you to intervene. You do not have sufficient warrant, sufficient grounds to intervene because you think it's in his own good. And yes,
What about the poor unwilling goat?
we assume we assume that the goat is having the time of his life. Whatever, I don't know. So, I was very, you know, I believe in animal rights too. That was very generous of you, taking that into account. You have no right to interfere in somebody else's liberty on the basis that, in your opinion, it's in that other person's good. And that too, it's actually a quite radical principle to make that claim. It occurs, versions of this occur every day of our lives, whether it's, for example, to take an obvious example, you're at the beach, correct? And you want to swim out past the distance that is permissible by the standards of the lifeguards in the city and so forth. And they prevent you, the lifeguards prevent you from going beyond a certain distance. And they say they're doing that, why? Why are they preventing you?
Your safety.
For your safety, for your own good. Should they have the right to do that? Should they have the right to do that? I'll give you a few more examples and then we'll hear you out.
Well, they're preventing potential harm.
We have laws in the United States, you have to use seatbelts. What's the rationale behind those laws for seatbelts? Excuse me?
Well,
And
it's a cost to society too.
say that again?
It's a cost to society.
We'll get to that in a moment. What is the rationale that's put forth? It's what?
Protects you.
Yes. It's for your own good. It protects you. Should those laws be enforceable? His own good, either physical or moral, says Mill, is not a sufficient warrant. To say that it protects you, says Mill, that's not grounds for society to intervene. Society has gone too far. Then we have laws, obviously, against taking drugs or certain drugs. What's the grounds for that?
They're harmful to you.
They're harmful to you. And therefore, society has the right. So, is Mill's principle valid? His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Is that valid, that principle? Elise?
I say so. I say it is valid because what we're measuring is the general cost of not infringing upon those rights that you mentioned. If we allow people to take drugs willy-nilly, the cost would be that society itself would be unable to function. There won't be, enough people to work certain jobs. These are all ridiculous examples, but the point that I'm making is that it is insufficient alone to weigh someone's individual rights for their own good against, whatever your moral judgment is, whatever your laws are for the sake of the law. But when we add in other factors, it becomes more justifiable.
So you accept the principle of interference in the three examples I gave, the swimming at the beach,
I accept the principle without only considering Mill's point. I believe Mill's point is extremely valid because without the added cost to society, infringing upon those rights would be incorrect and inappropriate.
Right, but I think there's a disconnect here. Mill is making the assumption, which we'll get to in a moment, he's making the assumption that there are certain actions of ours. There's a sphere, an area. There's a sphere in which our actions don't affect anybody else. They are only, he won't say only, but we'll get to it in a moment. Primarily, they affect just each of us. And in those areas, those exercises of liberty, he says, society should not have the right to interfere. Is that a valid assumption that there are some areas, let's take, if the person goes out to the beach, swims beyond a certain point, there's significant danger of him or her drowning. If he or she drowns, isn't that a traumatizing event for any of his or her significant others? Isn't that a huge harm to others? You're dead. Isn't that true also of enforcing the seatbelt law? That, yes, they say it's for your own good. That's true. Mill says if it's just for your own good, it's not sufficient grounds. But it's also true that it affects others. And that's one of the problems we're going to find with Mill. He has to deal with a very elementary problem. The problem can be put very simply, and he will address it. Isn't it true that any action we take, at some level and to some degree affects others? That this notion of an area that you carve out that just affects you is in many ways kind of abstract and detached from the real life experience of most human beings. Whatever action they take will affect others some way, except the most trivial. I admit there's a little trivial area.
Question.
Yes.
I don't know. Does he say that as soon as you cross the line from yourself to somebody else, that's considered others, or is it like
Yes.
quantitative? There's a number. It has to be.
No, it could be just one.
Any one other person.
Yes.
Got it.
One, or obviously it grows from one to society, all the way to society. But it's sufficient that it affects any one person for society to have the right to intervene. It poses all sorts of questions. Barbara said earlier, but she said these actions affect society as a whole in many cases. So society, let's say our former mayor, may he not rest in peace, Michael Bloomberg, if you recall at the very end of his interminable term of office, his last mayoral race, as you recall, he purchased, I think he paid, what was it, $1,000 per vote. But at the very end of his term of office, he proposed to limit the size of the soft drinks in places like McDonald's, because we supersize it, to the point that it looks like a wheat silo. It's true. Yell is from Europe, so he doesn't quite know what it looks like here, but you could probably put out a forest fire with some of these drinks. And so he proposed to put a limit on the size. And he was doing it for our own good. Mill says that's not sufficient warrant. What do you say, Albert? Should he have the right to do that? Or I shouldn't say he personally. Should society or the state have the right for our own good to put limits like that or place limits like that? Because there's one way to look at it, which I think was suggested earlier, is to say, well, we do in the United States have a problem with obesity, and in particular among kids. And society as a whole, as Elise was suggesting earlier, society as a whole pays a price for that. people end up in the hospital. Who in the end foots the bill? We're all footing the bill. So this notion of it's only affecting him, I think even in the case of soft drinks, you can make an argument, and you would think, well, it's my right to drink what I want. It's my right to eat what I want. My own good, you can't tell me what to do for my own good. I want to be fat. No, it does affect society. And then there's the question of, maybe for your own good, society should do that. What do you say? Does society have the right? Did Bloomberg have that right? Or was he interfering with your personal liberty because you're not hurting anyone?
Well, more so than who's to say that maintaining false beliefs isn't something that should be...
We'll get to false beliefs in a moment. How about just the simple example of the soft drinks?
I mean,
Should he have the right?
as long as it's absolutely clear by all, by the clearest of scientific evidence that it is harmful, then it makes sense that you would.
Well, junk food is harmful. I mean, any nutritionist will tell you that.
Well,
So how would you feel about limiting potato chip consumption? And how about chocolate? How about we all just eat fruits and vegetables? There's scientific evidence that that's the healthiest diet, or meat also.
But
So when you say if the scientific evidence shows it, then we should be allowed to limit it. So you're prepared to just eat lettuce and carrots?
no, in limited quantities, it is not necessarily harmful. So, I mean, maybe there would have to be instituted certain guidelines that are rigorously...
And the state has the right to do that?
It's possible.
I didn't say it's possible. I said, do you think they have the right to do that?
According to the...
Do you think Bloomberg should have had the right to outlaw Big Macs? I once, when I wasn't yet a vegetarian, there was once advertising triple.
You're a vegetarian now?
A long time. You're way behind, Yellow.
Yeah, I know.
You obviously haven't been watching my latest YouTubes. It was a triple decker, whatever you want to call it. I had never in my life had bowel movements like after I consumed that. or lack of bowel movements, however you want to look at it. I think that stuff should be banned. What do you think? How about Wendy's, Burger King, Kentucky Fried Chicken, all of it, go.
See, I'm not fully able to, give an absolute response because, this is where the moral, I think a lot of it has to do with the person's personal moral beliefs, their own systems too. I'm not sure what response to give because, I don't know.
But don't you think that junk food does do harm to our society?
It does, but
All
somebody else
the
may not
heart
believe so.
disease?
It makes a lot of money for people too.
Right.
It builds the economy. People are always eating it, spending money. What there should be, I think, on the part of health authorities and the state health authorities is an awareness of it, an educational awareness. And then you make your own decisions.
Imagine, okay, you're against the seatbelt law? It doesn't require great education to realize you might get hit by a car and your head will go right through the window. So you should wear a seatbelt.
There are really good drivers that probably would never need a seatbelt.
So you would favor abolishing the law?
I'm in favor of looking at it more closely maybe and seeing where it might also be a benefit to the insurance companies to keep their costs down.
Wait.
Less accidents.
Let's not go, look, I hate insurance companies as much as the next Homo sapien, but let's not go there. Let's try to just stick to common sense. Let's leave the insurance companies out for a moment. Does society have the right in certain places, in certain questions, yes, to legislate for your own good? On two grounds. They're making a reasoned judgment that it's doing harm to you, and it should be legislated on those grounds. And the second ground is it doesn't just affect you. When you consume these foods, don't use the seatbelts, the results affect a lot of people. So there are two possible grounds for saying Mill is wrong. One, maybe you think, well, society does have a right to make judgments like that. We want a healthy society. We want a healthy society. And right now in our society, child obesity is a very big problem. And second ground is, it's not true what Mill says. There's no action that really doesn't affect others. Everything we do, consuming a chocolate bar, and the chocolate bars now, you know, they're the size of a surfboard. Chocolate bars in my day were a little thing. Okay, Albert, what do you say?
I would say, like, society should put down legislation that prevents harm, but I mean, it's more complicated than this. But for instance, if the individuals in society, okay, it's hard for them to make choices for make alternative choices. So, for instance, like legislation regulating the health quality of food and drugs, like corporations can't sell food without properly checking the health quality while producing it. Like, you don't really have, if all food production weren't probably regulated, the individual, they don't have any meaningful choice between healthy food and unhealthy food. So they can't, so the government should intervene in that. For like McDonald's, the individual, they can make alternative choices.
I think, I'm not sure if I get your distinction, but I think what you're trying to say is you think society has the right to regulate certain basic, let's call it health features of food, to make sure the food is not poisonous and does not cause illness. They're allowed to do that for your good, but beyond that, I'm not sure where the distinction comes in. I would have to get more clarity, but maybe you can think it through and explain to the class. We'll take two more people, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Yeah. As a librarian, I often think about food for thought. Like, there are certain masterpieces which were banned in the previous generations, and now they're bestsellers. So one culture's banned book could be another culture's bestseller. So who is to decide, or as human beings, do we have some kind of a universal criteria of what we should consume and what we shouldn't? Not just in terms of physical food, but also ideas.
Okay, we're going to get to that, and we're going to have a very big discussion about that, so I'm going to just hold it off. Yella, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I think there's also a way of sort of turning this argument around. I don't know, it's a little bit of a trick. But if we take the issue of fast food, junk food, and so on, we're talking about the consumer all the time. But there's also the other actor, the corporations that are selling this stuff. So there's also the argument to be made that by putting in certain legislation, you're preventing these corporations that have made a lot of people addicted to this junk food, that you're preventing them from doing harm to others. But basically, when it comes down to it, it comes down to the same point of you making a judgment call on the consumer's desires and whether it's good for them or not. But,
Does everyone understand what Yella is saying? Mm-hmm. You could make the argument that by instituting laws of this kind, you are preventing the producers from doing harm to others. Right, but that still comes down to who decides what harm is. Okay, let's turn to, I think we have it now. We're going to call on Ethan to staff this here. Do you mind? Because you're the tech expert along with you, but we'll let him do it today. In the spirit of Donald Trump, we won't use any foreign labor. So search for the word undeceived, UNDECEIVED. You can either, I think it might be, okay. Good. So we're going to have you read now, but there is a sphere of action.
But there's a sphere of action in which society, as distinguished from the individual, has, if any, only an indirect interest.
Okay, so now he's going to try to he's going to try to flesh out the distinction between your sphere of personal liberty versus society, where society can and can't intervene. Go ahead.
Comprehending all that portion of a person's life and conduct which affects only himself, or if it also affects others, only with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation. When I say only himself, I mean directly and in the first instance, for whatever affects himself may affect others through himself.
Now skip a little to this then.
This then is the appropriate region of human liberty. It comprises first the inward domain of consciousness, demanding liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. The liberty of expressing and publishing opinions may seem to fall under a different principle, since it belongs to that part of the conduct of an individual which concerns other people. But being almost of as much importance as the liberty of thought itself, and resting in great part on the same reasons, is practically inseparable from it.
Go ahead.
Secondly, the principle requires liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, of doing as we like, subject to such consequences as may follow, without impediment from our fellow creatures, so long as what we do does not harm them, even though they should think our conduct foolish, perverse, or wrong. Thirdly,
that was Ethan, foolish, perverse, and wrong, or at any rate, in Cecilia's opinion.
Thirdly, from this liberty of each individual follows the liberty within the same limits of combination among individuals, freedom to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others, the persons combining being supposed to be of full age and not forced or deceived.
Okay, so now he's trying to be more specific about this principle of liberty and where it does and doesn't apply. So what is the new stipulation that he's entering? You're allowed to do as you please so long as what?
You're not deceived. You're not fooled in any way.
No, that's a little further on. Just at the beginning, you're allowed to do as you please so long as, well, let me read it and then I'll go over it. Excuse me. Okay, just give me 1/2 second. Must be over here. Yes. There is a sphere of action to which society, as distinguished from the individual, has, if any, only an indirect interest, comprehending all that portion of a person's life and conduct which affects only himself, or if it also affects others, only with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation. When I say only himself, now he's going to acknowledge anything you do really does affect everyone else. So he's going to make a qualification. When I say only himself, I mean directly and in the first instance. For whatever affects himself may affect others through himself. So what's the distinction he's making here? Anyone? What's the distinction? Efrat?
Be a first degree harm to second degree.
He's making a distinction.
Time and space. Immediacy.
He's making a distinction. Some things that we do affect ourselves firstly and directly. The things which affect us in the first place and directly, those expressions of liberty are our own, society can intervene in. If it affects you directly and in the first instance, meaning you are the principal beneficiary or the principal loser from this conduct. This then is the appropriate region of human liberty, where it affects you directly and in the first instance. It comprises first the inward domain of consciousness, meaning the liberty of your own thoughts, demanding liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. The liberty of expressing and publishing opinions may seem to fall under a different principle, since it belongs to that part of the conduct of an individual which concerns other people. But being almost of as much importance as the liberty of thought itself, and resting in great part on the same reasons, is practically inseparable for it. So what's he saying there? Ethan?
So he's saying that freedom of outside, once you get outside your own thoughts, right? Like the freedom to express your thoughts to others, to publish them, has pretty much the same justification as you having the thought.
He says if you have the right to think an idea, you have to have the right to express the idea. Now he says, I recognize that they're not the same thing, because if you express it, he recognizes you will affect others. So I might think, I don't want to offend anyone, but you meet somebody and your first thought is, geez, he's so ugly. And obviously, just thinking it doesn't affect anyone. Expressing that thought, he says, he acknowledges it does concern others. But he says the two are practically inseparable. If you allow for freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, then he says you can't bar expressing those ideas, because they're pretty much, he says, inseparable. Whether they're inseparable or not, we're going to have to discuss it at great length when we discuss liberty of speech. But we'll think about it. But we'll put it off. As I said, we're going to have a large discussion later. Second, the principle requires liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, of doing as we like, subject to such consequences as may follow, without impediment, without interference from our fellow creatures, so long as what we do does not harm them, even though they should think our conduct foolish, perverse, and wrong. Thirdly, from this liberty of each individual follows the liberty within the same limits of combination among individuals, freedom to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others, the persons combining being supposed to be of full age and not forced or deceived. So what are the liberties he's laying out here in terms of our own constitution and our own history? What are the liberties he's describing here? Freedom of speech and freedom of?
To assemble?
Yes, the freedom of speech, the freedom to publish, the freedom to assemble. And Mill says that these freedoms are kind of integral to each other. You can't really separate them. If you have the right to think a thought, you should have the right to express the thought. If you have the right to express the thought, you should have the right to to assemble with others who share that thought. We will, as I said, we will get to it. I'm just right now just laying out the framework before we get into the argument. Mill makes one famous exception to these rules of liberty. And for the sake of fairness, I think we have to look at the exception, though usually I skip over it. However, more and more in recent times, I think it's not correct to skip over it, so we're going to look at it. Enter in the search mechanism barbarians.
Page 19.
19?
Dealing with barbarians?
Yes, so we're going to start with those who are still, who would like to read it for us? I think, Ethan, it's you. We need the microphone for you. Okay. The way we've been doing it, Ethan, if you can just highlight it from those who are still up to free and equal discussion, so up to here. Go ahead.
Those who are still in a state to require being taken care of by others must be protected against their own actions as well as against external injury. For the same reason, we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as in its non-age.
Non-age would be what we would call minors. Yes?
The early difficulties in the way of spontaneous progress are so great that there is seldom any choice of means for overcoming them, and a ruler full of the spirit of improvement is warranted in the use of any expedients that will attain an end, perhaps otherwise unattainable. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement, and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Liberty, as a principle, has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion.
Okay, who wants to put in simple words what he's saying here? You want to try? Walid? What's he saying there?
Simply he wants to protect the minors, and then he wants push back on the barbarian.
Excuse me, you have to speak louder.
He's trying to push back on the barbarian way of things. I understand.
Well, who is he referring to here now? What? You have to speak louder.
Is it adolescence? I mean, anyone under supposedly?
Yeah, he starts off with the obvious. The obvious limitation on liberty that kids whose, we say, their reasoning faculty is not yet sufficiently developed, that they can make decisions in their best interest, who understand what their best interest is, that children don't have the same rights to liberty as adults. And that's a fairly uncontroversial concept. That on the grounds we justify it, as I said, is that children, their reasoning faculty has not been sufficiently developed that they can make reasoned decisions about what's in their best interest. But he's not just limiting it to children. What is he saying here, Barbara?
He's saying that government can take a much stronger hand to, if the society are barbaric.
Well, what's he talking about here?
It's talking about non-white races.
Yeah, he's basically talking about the non-European world. And he says in those parts of the world where people have not yet sufficiently developed their reasoning capacity, those races, as he puts it, those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as in its non-age. That is to say that there are certain peoples whose mental development doesn't go beyond that of children. And because their mental development hasn't gone beyond that of children, it is legitimate for a despot, a tyrant, to try to improve people who couldn't be improved otherwise because their reasoning faculty is not yet developed. And he says the principle of liberty is not applicable to the time before the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. So Mill makes the point that if your mental faculty has not yet been sufficiently developed that you can respond to a reasoned argument, then a despot has the right to try to improve you because you're not yet capable of improving yourself. Just like the relationship between a parent and a child is a despotic relationship. A parent can say, this is for your own best interest, you can't do it or you can do it. And he says in the same way, a despotic ruler has the right to do that with what he calls certain races barbarians. Does that sound right? Don't shake your head in political correctness. What's wrong with that argument? Do you agree? Let's try to reason it through, because we cannot fall back on political correctness. We have to figure out, if you don't agree with the argument, what's wrong with it? We can't just say it's racist, or it's European, or it's Western. That's a label. It's not an argument. So, let's start with his first premise. Premise number one of Mill is, we all accept the fact that parents have the right to a despotic relationship with children. Is that correct? A parent has the right, your name, just remind me of your name? Tim. A parent has the right to order a child to do X, Y, and Z because the child is not yet of sufficiently developed mental faculty to make decisions in his or her best interest. You agree with that?
To a point.
But you would agree even to a point. But
it depends on the extent of the despotism employed.
But you will agree parents have a pretty despotic relationship to kids. I mean, you can prettify it however much you want, but
they're required to be responsible for developing human beings that are not capable of making
correct.
rational judgments.
Good. So parents are required to make judgments for children who are themselves on their own not capable of rational judgment or capable of weighing choices in a free and equal discussion. They're not yet able to do that. Children are impulsive, they are they tend to respond emotionally and instinctually.
Not all of them.
Not all, but every society has to have some cutoff point. You can be 16 years of age, you can be 18 years of age, you can be 21 years of age, and we will grant that the age changes, but we will also grant there's always an age below which parents have a despotic relationship, okay, with the child. And
So
certainly,
let me ask a question.
yes.
Is it correct to say that the parents making decision for an underage child, is it correct to say it's despotic?
I would say despotic in the sense that the child has no recourse but to accept it. The child can't say no. And that's a despotic relationship, I think. You are going to school tomorrow. You know, don't tell me I don't feel like it. You're going to school tomorrow. It's cold outside. You are going to put on your mittens or your gloves and your hat. And don't tell me I want to play in the snow naked. You don't have that choice. So that is despotic. The child is compelled. Now, Mill says there are certain peoples, or as he calls it, races in the world, whose mental development is the equivalent of that of a child, and they are unable, they are not capable of improving themselves by free and equal discussion. And these backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as in its non-age, as in the entire people function at the level of children. Now, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, you see, like when the British went to India, the practice of sati was going on, widow burning. And the British
You're going too fast because a lot of people won't know what that is.
Widow burning. I mean,
No.
the wife would be burnt alive when the husband dies in Hinduism. And this practice was very common when the British went to India. And they had to use force. It was a despotic decision that no more, it has to end now, which I think was the right thing to do in terms of human rights. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, there are different standards.
But you're going way too fast. How many people know what sati is? S-U-T-T-E-E. Raise your hand. So you see,
The widow burning, I said
Yeah,
widow burning.
no, yeah, now we know.
so it's when the husband dies, the wife is burnt in sacrifice. And it was called sati. And the British used that. It was the most popular argument for justifying their despotic relationship to India, that these were backward barbarian peoples and we had to carry on in a despotic fashion and impose a ruler who improves the people because they're incapable of improving themselves. So what's wrong? Do you agree with Mill?
Yeah, when it comes to, burning women alive, I would say Mill was right in that. But I would rather go case by case. I wouldn't make it a rule that, whatever the British thought they should have done. I mean, there was a lot of exploitation which they did too. And I wouldn't agree with that. And like the caste system is still flourishing despite British rule of more than 100 years.
Ephraim?
If we take the children, the reason you say children cannot say no, they can say no. But as I think that probably most people have experienced, when they try to say no, they found themselves crawling back, groveling back, because they're like, okay, fine, I'll do what you want, but I need to eat and I need to be warm because I ran out of home and I'm cold and I'm hungry. So you don't get far as a kid, you come crawling back and you have some understanding of what you're getting from your parents, even though most of the time you're resenting that despotic, but when it comes to the test, you come crawling back. So, and maybe if children are left to their own, they'll go through bad experiences and grow up fine. I don't know. But when it comes to this, I feel like, and it's a little intuitive because I can't, for whatever reason, think it through, Mill sees all of humanity as one society, that's his society, and these other races are, So he goes and he says, you have to be, you're not developed, you're going to do this, without asking what happens if they're being left to their own. That's a different society with different rules. Whatever happens there, let them burn their widows. And if they are, so it's tough, because then I'm sure the widows would come saying, hey, can we stop that? But but everybody else be like, no, it's fine. It's so there's something about other societies that this is not Mill society. There's no saying what's underdeveloped, overdeveloped. It's just a different animal.
Well, Mill is not, doesn't claim, I'm not sure if it's valid, he's not claiming that certain societies are not eligible for the principle of liberty because he disagrees with their practices or disagrees with their culture, disagrees with their mores, or customs. He's not saying that. He says the reason it doesn't apply to them is that their mental faculty is insufficiently developed. They're not yet capable of reason or making judgments on the basis of free and equal discussion. Is that a valid principle? Ethan?
Well, it seems like his comparison of like groups of people to kind of like children doesn't really work, because there's like a relationship of dependence between parents and children, right? Where children have to rely on their parents, but no such relationship exists between, random other societies and his society, right? So in that way, the analogy doesn't really work.
Well, I would say, I'm listening to you carefully. It is true that there's a relationship of dependence between a child and an adult, which is not equivalent to other races, to use his term. But Mill is looking at it from a slightly different angle. Namely, does a parent have the right to engage in a despotic relationship with the child? Even if the child were not dependent, but should a parent have that right? And I think the consensus would be yes, because simply put, a child doesn't know what's in its best interest yet. It just doesn't know. And so it's not just dependence which validates the right of a parent. It's the fact which we all accept, that until the child's mental faculty has been sufficiently developed, the child shouldn't be allowed to act on his or her own choices because they're not based on reason. You agree with that? And then why isn't that principle not applicable elsewhere in the context that he gives? Yes, Yella?
I think there was someone in the back first.
Oh, I didn't see.
Oh,
Go ahead.
That was me. Then the point I was considering is that there is an aspect of dependency that's being discussed in this context. That's where the line is drawn. Those who are still in a state to require being taken care of by others. So if we consider that perhaps, there is that is the line that's drawn, then maybe if the society is flourishing on its own, perhaps they should be able to burn their widows. And yet,
but he says they require being taken care of by others, but he's saying for a very specific reason, because they are unable on their own to make reasoned judgments. That's why they require being taken care of by others. Not that they're not self-supporting in the sense that your parent has a job and income and so forth. It's not the dependency, it's the lack of capacity to make reasoned judgments on one's own.
I don't mean in context of financial dependency,
Mhm.
but intellectual dependency.
Yes.
Does, you know, I maintain that that is where the line is drawn. You know, I'm agreeing with the discussion point that that society itself may be in a position where it is behaving in a fashion or doing something, committing an act that may not be working in its best interest, but the line is drawn at the opinion of another society, you know, the intellectual capacity that's being defined by when they're no longer functional on their own without interference.
And therefore you conclude?
I believe my conclusion is that that's relative, where someone is functional and not functional in an intellectual capacity.
Okay. So the objection that's being raised right now is, how do you determine when a person's intellectual faculty has been sufficiently developed that he or she is able to weigh and judge what's in his or her best interest? There are two aspects to that. First of all, everyone will agree that in every society, at some level, the decision is arbitrary. We say 16 years old, 18 years old, 21 years old, you're now a man, you're now a woman, you're now an adult, you're now a grown-up, you're now able to make decisions for yourself, you are no longer under your parents' sway. So at some level, it is arbitrary in every society, and we have to acknowledge that. But acknowledging it, we all accept it as a principle that at some level, at some age, you're not capable of making reasoned choices. And is there anything intrinsically wrong with saying that can also apply to whole races of people? We all accept it as a principle, I think, that maybe we disagree about whether it should be 16, 18, or 21, but we all accept as a principle that below a certain age, the human being should not be making decisions for itself. So why can't we apply it, as Mill does, across the board to whole races of people? What's wrong with that? Yellen.
Yeah, I think there are two interesting steps that he takes here that we need to understand. One is, his whole argument beforehand on liberty and society in general is predicated and seen from the perspective of the individual. And he completely lets it go when he talks about non-white individuals, or how you want to phrase it, European or these different races. He talks about whole groups of people. The individual disappears on the scene, which is, I think, an important step for him to be able to make this argument. And then, secondly, in his other arguments on society not being able to make judgments for you, he lets it go here as well, in the sense that he, as a foreign society, is able to make a judgment for this other group of people, right? And he doesn't seem to make an argument for why he's capable of doing that.
Well, he does make an argument. He thinks that this is exactly the argument that, what's your name? Nomi. Exactly the argument Nomi made. The British said we're able to judge it's in the best interests of that society that they get rid of Sute.
Exactly, that's what they're saying. And then Indian society could say, we think it's in the best interests of British society that they don't condemn homosexuals to death penalties. So we are going to invade Britain and we're going to impose a despotism because they are not yet capable of recent debate around this issue.
Right, and to which he would answer, there's a world of difference between an opinion that's an opinion that has been reached on the basis of impulse, like a child reaches an opinion based on impulse, and opinion based on free and equal discussion. And he says, so long as a society is incapable of the give and take of a free and equal discussion, it doesn't have the right to liberty. Let's put it off. I just wanted to mention it. I think you've all hinted at it in different ways. You can make the argument, as Hillary Clinton seemed to make during the presidential election, that virtually anybody who supported Trump was incapable of a free and equal discussion, that they were deplorables, that they were, what?
Yeah, she says that half of them were.
Yeah, she changed it later. I only meant half, and that was really a very clever way to lose an election, I think. But you can make the argument, and many people seem to be of the opinion, especially if they're liberals, and they live in the Upper East or West Side, and they vacation in the Hamptons, and they went to Harvard, and they hang out in Hollywood. They seem to think that everybody who voted for Trump basically fits into this category of barbarians who are incapable of improvement through free and equal discussion because they're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, and so on and so forth. They're functioning at the level of barbarians, and then it very easily becomes a justification for a despotism even here, not only over there, but here. They say these people, no rational person capable of free and equal discussion could have voted for that thing as president. And then how do you answer that? That's the, if you heard the post-election discussion, it was widely reported that the way you know who voted for Trump versus Hillary, the single main indicator was what? Does anyone remember? Was education. That if you had below a college education, there was a high probability you were going to vote for Trump, above a college education. So the basic argument was anyone who voted for Trump was stupid. I mean, that's, it's crude and vulgar, but that was the argument that was being made. And that's frankly what most people who voted for Hillary thought, that you had to be stupid. So you effectively fit into this category of barbarians, incapable of free and equal discussion because no reasoning person would have voted for him. So there's a kind of slippery slope here. Before you start off talking about barbarians and other races, but very quickly the same argument can be easily applied here to certain categories of people, races or sub-races like crackers and deplorables. Yes.
Very short comment. No grown-up has come to be a grown-up without being a child first.
Mm-hmm.
But here, there's no. So I'm making a judgment on somebody else that I was never that someone else. So there's something about the children that is different just because we were all children, even though grown-ups are very hypocritical many times. I think they make wrong decisions regarding children. There's still some common basis by the fact that we were all children once. I don't know about India and the burning of it's a tough thing to say this is a result of not having equal and free discussion. Maybe there is equal free discussion in some way that is not my...
But Yella made the point, it's very easy for an outside observer to look at our society and make judgments like that.
Right.
How can the richest country in the world have homelessness? How can there be homeless people in the richest city in the world? These people are obviously incapable of rational thought, and they need an enlightened despot. So we should always be careful before we pass judgment on Sute. And you know, it may happen. I can't predict. I don't know, and nobody else in this class. We'll talk about it later. It may happen in 1,000 years or 100 years if the planet survives. The judgment is going to be that abortion falls into the same category as child sacrifice and Sute. We don't know that. It may fall, in which case we would be a most barbaric society. And that is, I think, it's another problem with the way Mill formulates the question. Let me now turn to some of the basic premises of Mill's argument before we get to the argument itself. First of all, Mill in On Liberty, he is not concerned with abstract rights. What does that mean? I have the right to say what I feel because it's my God-given right.
As if it's intrinsic.
He's not, excuse me?
As if it's intrinsic.
I can't hear you.
As if it's intrinsic.
Yes, as if it's an intrinsic right to us as human beings. Mill is not interested in that kind of argument. Mill is interested in an argument based on utility, on usefulness. Mill is going to argue not that you have a right, free to be you and me, as I think Marlowe Thomas put it about 250 years ago. Am I correct?
Yes, you did.
Okay. You don't know what we're talking about. And you know what? No loss. You're not missing anything. She's not saying each of us free to be you and me. No, Mill is saying that there is a value, there is a usefulness in allowing for liberty of thought. If you turn to turn to, let's see, ultimate
appeal?
Yes. I regard,
Page 20.
good. I regard utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions. But it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. So he's going to argue that the value of liberty, both of speech and of conduct, the value of liberty is it somehow benefits us. But when he speaks about us, he doesn't necessarily mean each of us as individuals, but society as a whole. There is some benefit to be gained, some benefit to be had by allowing us liberty. What that benefit is, we'll get to later, but for the moment, we'll just keep in mind that the kind of argument he's making is, it's not the God-given right, the right as rights endowed to us by our Creator. He's not interested in that kind of argument. He wants to show liberty is useful. Liberty of speech is useful, and liberty of conduct is useful. Now, just to sketch in a little, why is it useful? So let's turn to, just Google the word bad, the B-A-D.
Bad taxes?
What? No?
No.
Go a little,
Bad what?
bad men.
35?
35.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, it's a simple sentence, but it's an important one. Would you like to read it for us, Albert, in the opinion? No? This is the wrong one.
No, maybe you were.
Page 41, there's another bad
I think
one.
you were.
41.
41?
Yes, I think you were.
No?
It is still often argued.
4 occurrences of bad men. It's
in the
42,
opinion,
it's
that one.
42
In the opinion of
little-
bad
it's
men.
42
In the opinion
little
not bad.
after-
Yeah, right there.
Okay. Good. Would you like to read for us, Albert, in the opinion?
Oh, no, not too far.
42.
Mhm.
It's wrong, it's so bad. There.
In the opinion?
In the opinion, here.
In the opinion not of bad men, but of the best men, no belief which is contrary to truth can be really useful.
In the opinion not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing which is contrary to truth can be really useful. Nothing that is contrary to truth can be really useful. Do you agree with that, Liam? If it's not true, it's not useful. Mill's making a basic premise here. It's in the nature of human beings that they want to know the truth. In the opinion of not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing which is contrary to truth is useful. That we want to know the truth. Truth is useful. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think it sets a baseline for which everyone, like, kind of unites everyone and kind of the purpose of life is to seek things that are true in human nature, and because once you get into deceit and things, it ruins everything. I think it's just, yeah, it provides like the foundation for all pursuits.
Last class, when I taught this last semester, there was a clip which I couldn't find right now. It was Bertrand Russell, and he was asked, Bertrand Russell, who was Mill was his godfather, and Russell was the giant, the Titanic intellect of the first half of the 20th century. And there was a discussion of religion, and he was very categoric in his dismissal of religion. And he said, it's not true. So, you have it, Yella?
Well, there are many tips, but I don't know which one.
Look at just do Bertrand Russell atheism.
Bertrand Russell on religion?
Yes. You have
59, 3 minutes?
How much?
3 minutes?
Yeah, it was very short, that's it. You want to just go to it for a moment, because it's worth looking at. Just put in...
Bertrand Russell on religion.
Just go to YouTube. Okay, Bertrand Russell, YouTube. You're on Google right now. Okay, here it is. So I want you to hear it, and you'll see why I'm bringing it up in this context.
Can you play this?
You want to turn up the sound?
Yeah. There's no speakers
Also
of
the
it.
sound on YouTube itself.
Because I see no evidence whatever for any of the Christian dogmas, I've examined all the stock arguments in favour of the existence of God, and none of them seem to me to be logically valid.
Do you think there's a practical reason for having a religious belief for many people?
Well, there can't be a practical reason for believing what isn't true. That's quite, at least I rule it out as impossible. Either the thing is true or it isn't. If it is true, you should believe it, and if it isn't, you shouldn't. And if you can't find out whether it's true or whether it isn't, you should suspend judgment. But you can't, it seems to me, a fundamental dishonesty and a fundamental treachery to intellectual integrity to hold a belief because you think it's useful and not because you think it's true.
Well, I was thinking of those people who find that
Just stop for a
kind of
moment.
religious code
He says,
helps them to live their
if it's not true, it can't be useful. He's obviously echoing his godfather, and he's saying it doesn't make sense to me. If I've reached a conclusion religion is not true, then he says it can't be useful, or in Mill's terms, in the opinion not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing which is contrary to truth can be useful. And Liam went along with that. Many moons ago, a good 30 years ago, I worked in a pretty tough neighborhood, and there was a woman, her name was Sheila Williams, and she had a really tough life. Her husband was her ex-husband was a drug addict. He had physically abused her. She was living with her 5 children in the public housing in 10th Avenue and 26th Street, Chelsea area, but the tough part of Chelsea. And she was very religious. And I was then, less fanatically now, I was then a resolute, fanatical atheist. And we occasionally had talks about it. We were quite good friends. And she said to me once, look, Norman, if I have to wake up each morning thinking that all there is in my life is what I see around me, I wouldn't bother getting up. And it's my belief in the religion that keeps me going. And then I thought to myself, well, I think the religion is not true. Would it be useful for me to dissuade her and tell her, try to prove to her there is no God? Would that be useful? Russell is very categoric here. Do you mind playing it again? Because I just want you to hear it from the beginning. Because this is the Millian spirit in the flesh, so to speak.
Why are you not a Christian?
Because I see no evidence whatever for any of the Christian dogmas. I've examined all the stock arguments in favor of the existence of God, and none of them seem to me to be logically valid.
Do you think there's a practical reason for having a religious belief for many people?
Well, there can't be a practical reason for believing what isn't true.
Stop that for a moment. There can't be a practical reason for believing something that isn't true, says Russell. Go ahead.
I rule it out as impossible. Either the thing is true or it isn't. If it is true, you should believe it, and if it isn't, you shouldn't. And if you can't find out whether it's true or whether it isn't, you should suspend judgment. But you can't, it seems to me, a fundamental dishonesty and a fundamental treachery to intellectual integrity to hold a belief because you think it's useful and not because you think it's true.
Well, I was thinking of those people who find that some kind of religious code helps them to live their lives. It gives them a very strict set of rules, the rights and the wrongs.
Yes, but you know, those rules are generally quite mistaken. Great many of them do more harm than good, and they would probably be able to find a rational morality that they could live by if they dropped this irrational, traditional taboo morality.
Okay, because this goes into another area. Well, what do you say, Cecilia? Is Mill right? Nothing which is contrary to truth is useful?
I think he's talking about religion. I think religion is a good place to start. And religion is man-made. And in coming to that, you realize because it's man-made, man is susceptible to frailty. So it's not perfect in its sense. But it's a good starting point because it kind of gives you, it provides you with a guideline and a community. So you feel that interconnectedness with other people. You feel that.
But if it's based on untrue premises, untrue claims, can it be useful?
Who, I mean,
well,
who is to say?
He says,
okay.
I reasoned it through, I searched it, and he did at a quite young age, and apparently he invested a lot of his intellectual power in trying to make sense of religion. He comes to the conclusion it's not true. The fact, and then he says, I don't see how something that's not true can be useful. He's saying exactly what Mill is saying.
But
it's not true. It can't be useful.
Himself up like the Pharisee at the temple's front and said, it's not true. I mean, what does he base that on? Because it comes down to faith, something that's intrinsic, something you believe in, something above you, spiritual, sublime, divine. I mean, who is he to be the barometer of such beliefs?
I understand that argument, but I still think there's a question here. I have come to the conclusion that sometimes things can be untrue, but they can also be useful. They give people a reason to live. So I'm not as dogmatic as I once was on this particular question. But on the other hand, I do think there's something in the nature of us as human beings, and which I think Liam was pointing to. It's kind of a basic, inherent, intrinsic characteristic of us as human beings. We want to know the truth. That if it's a lie, I don't want the lie. If I were to ask Liam, if your wife, your girlfriend is cheating on you, do you want to know?
Yes.
And Elise, if, as is quite probable if you know men, he's cheating on you, do you want to know?
Yes.
Yes, sometimes we have an expression in English, truth is a bitter pill to swallow, which means it's often painful. Truths are as often unhappy as they are happy, but we want to know them. We want to know the truth. And there's nothing useful about living a lie, I think. I want to just move on a little because we have short time. Okay, we'll take just a couple more comments. Go ahead.
One quick comment about, one of the major atheists today is Richard Dawkins. And he was asked a question on Channel 14 by Charlie Rose that is there one question in your science career that you have not been able to answer? And he said he has no clue what is human consciousness, what is subjective consciousness. So it is considered the hard problem. Nobody has any clue, no philosopher, no scientist has any clue what is human consciousness. And until and unless we do not have any clue of something so fundamental which makes us aware of the universe, we cannot deny or believe that there is a God or not. So it's an open question, and Bertrand Russell himself was an agnostic. He wasn't an atheist. So just to put it out there.
Okay. Albert, and then let's move on. Go ahead.
Well, with regards to Bertrand Russell, he technically considered himself an agnostic in terms of like leaving the possibility that there may be a God based on evidence he doesn't know. But he says it's practically close to his position on agnosticism is practically close to atheism as much as possible. because he just thinks that the state of affairs, there's no reason to believe in God any more than most people believe in America.
Well, anyone, and this is also a Mill principle, which we'll get to later, we're all human beings, which means we're all fallible, and if we're all fallible, there's always the possibility that we're wrong. So you have to always, in any circumstance, leave open the possibility that your belief is wrong. But that wouldn't make him an agnostic. He's an atheist, but he recognizes that there's always the possibility I'm wrong, which is different than saying you're an atheist. I think the world is not flat. I'm pretty convinced of that, but I have to leave open the possibility that I'm wrong because we're fallible, we're not God. Let's just try a couple of more passages before time is up. Turn to Gainers, Gainers.
Gainers by suffering?
Yes. Let's begin with the only freedom which deserves the name. The only freedom which deserves the name. Ethan, you want to read it because you have the microphone there?
Sure. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental and spiritual. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest.
Okay. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. What's he saying there? Anyone want to translate it into simple English? Somebody else? Barbara? Mankind are greater gain.
I lost when I was back with Bertram.
Okay.
I don't know what
We're on page 23.
Liam? Mankind are greater gainers.
I was just going to say it seems that it's more difficult to be a good person, and that there's a struggle in wanting to be good, where it's easier to kind of give into any whim or fancy that you have, and because you think that benefits others.
No.
Live and let live.
No.
It's basically saying we're better off letting people do their own thing and express themselves individually than we are trying to force them to conform, right?
Okay. He's making an argument here. Remember when he said he believes in the utilitarian principle, he says that it's the principle as applied to society as a whole. It's not just that you gain from liberty. He's saying society as a whole, mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. So, your name again? Yes.
David.
David.
As long as they're not determined to be barbarians.
Wait. We'll look at that right now. So, David, do you have children? No. Who has children? Okay, Cecilia, well. So, you want your child to be a success. Maybe you want your child to be a physician. Maybe you want your child to be a lawyer. Maybe you want your child to be a banker, a hedge fund manager, whatever. And then your child comes home. What's his name?
Raphael.
What?
Raphael.
Raphael comes home and...
Raphael, like Raphael.
Okay, Raphael. And Raphael comes home and he says, Mommy, I have finally decided what I want to do with my life. I want I want to become a subway musician. I want to perform on 42nd Street and Times Square. That's my hope and my aspiration, my goal. And of course you're extremely pained as a mother because you had such high hopes and expectations for your child. He or she would be bringing home 6 figures at the end of the year. And here it's going to be just relying on charity of a pitiful, pathetic subway musician. It's going to be so embarrassing to the rest of the family. What does your son do? Oh, he's a doctor. What does your son do? Oh, she's a lawyer. What does your son do, Cecilia? Oh, my son, he performs on 42nd Street. Really? 42nd Street? Yeah, and the subway, the intersection of the number 1 train and the queue. It's painful. Mill says, but we all gain by letting people make decisions which we think are not wise. They're not wise decisions in our opinion. They're painful decisions for us to have to bear. How do we gain? How do we gain as individuals and as a society by letting people do what they want rather than doing what we think is in their best interest? Mankind are greater gainers. Notice he uses the word suffering. He knows that often decisions individuals make cause us to suffer. Suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves. We are gainers. We gain as a society by letting people live their lives as seems good to themselves, then compelling each to live as seems good to the rest, rather than forcing people to live the way we think they should live. How do we gain? Here was Albert. He had a brilliant future ahead of him, studying physics at Carnegie Mellon. His parents were so proud. Physics, Carnegie Mellon. And then he comes home one day and he says, Mom, Dad, I'm dropping out of Carnegie Mellon. I've decided to organize for the revolution. They're South Korean immigrants. This is not what they wanted for their child. They are crushed. They are shattered. A revolutionary? I thought you were going to be a physicist, Albert. And then Albert, just like Ethan, you remember you had your copy of Mill? Where he said, it was not sufficient warrant,
Oh, yeah.
remember?
The goat.
And now Albert has his copy of Mill. And he says, mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. How do your parents gain by your decision? They're suffering. How do they gain? Mill acknowledges they're suffering. How do they gain? How does society gain by the fact that somebody who could have been a brilliant physicist is now probably living in Union Square Park in a tent, can't pay his bills barely, probably will end up without kids. It's going to be so pathetic. How does mankind gain from that? Mill claims they gain. Albert, how do they gain? How would you convince your parents they gain from your decision to drop physics for revolution?
I'm not sure if that's the current line of argument I would go towards. That's their gain. It's just a choice.
He claims they gain. It's not just a question
He
of...
doesn't claim they gain with that one particular choice. He claims that society as a whole
Gains, yes.
gains, right?
How does society gain?
So that's still compatible with them maybe not gaining anything from this particular case.
Yes, it's true, but I still think an argument can be made that even his parents gain by that decision. How would you convince them they gain?
I mean,
Okay, we have 3 more minutes and we'll close. Yeah.
I mean, my parents.
Everyone understand what Yella is saying? Yella is saying that Mill's not necessarily saying that his parents will be gainers. You could say that he's just saying mankind in general. But I think you can make an argument that his parents gain. How do they gain?
Broaden their perspective through the experience of their son, which differs from theirs.
Yes, that's a kind. Say it?
He would be happy. He is
Yes,
pursuing-
one obvious gain is if he's doing what he wants to do with his life, he's going to be happier. And presumably if he's happier, they will be happier. I think that's an obvious gain. What else, Elise? How else does society gain?
Well,
Or his
I
parents?
could say that his parents would gain with the knowledge that allowing him to pursue his own actions, pursue his own freedoms, may or may not benefit society in a greater way, but that they and their impositions would have restricted that potential gain. That the limitation could be more harmful.
How could it be more harmful? The argument Elise is making is that if you try to force somebody to do or be something they're not, it would cause more harm than letting them be who they want to be. So how would it cause more harm?
Well, let's pursue the argument that he does become a physicist and he's deeply unhappy being a physicist. He becomes a drunkard, starts beating his partner.
Never talk to his parents.
Never talk to his parents, exactly.
I probably also wouldn't be an effective physicist if I don't like to.
Yeah, I think that's another argument. I want to just repeat what Albert said before we take off. If you're forced to do what you don't want to do, you're not going to be very good at it. And so society gains because when you do what you want to do, you give your all to it. When you do what others compel you to do, you probably won't be particularly effective at what you're doing. So if you want to use sort of like a physics analogy, it's the amount of energy that society benefits from when you do what you want to do as against doing what you're compelled to do. The amount of energy, the total amount of energy society can claim is going to be considerably greater when people are doing what they want to do than when they're compelled to do what they don't want to do.